had burst through the wrong door. Steam hit my face before I could even gasp. Candles flickered wildly from the force of my entrance, and my eyes, my traitorous, disbelieving eyes, landed on him before my mind could warn me to look away. Dorian Ashvale, the Duke of Crenmoor, the most feared and coldest man in all of England, stood in the center of his private dressing room with nothing but shadows and silence around him. I was the new lady's companion. Petty, the scatterbrained housemaid, had pointed me toward what she called the linen chamber on the eastern wing. She had been terribly wrong. Every bone in my body screamed at me to turn, to run, to pretend my eyes had seen absolutely nothing. But my feet had forgotten how to move. And he did not grab a robe. He did not bark for the guards. He did not even flinch or look away in shame. He turned his head slowly, the way a man turns when he already owns every room, every breath, and every heartbeat within his walls. Those gray eyes found mine like a blade finding its mark. Then in a voice so low it rattled something deep inside my chest, he said, "You are either very lost or very bold. Which are you?" My mouth forgot every word I had ever learned, that one wrong door, that one terrible mistake. It would unravel everything I thought I knew about the Duke of Crenmoor and about myself. Now tell me, if you had walked through that door by accident, would you have run or stayed? Drop your answer below. And if this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe. We are only just beginning. I counted my steps wrong. That was the simple truth of it. Petty had told me 14 steps down the eastern corridor, then turn left at the third door. I had counted 14 steps, turned left, and pushed open the third door with the kind of confident ignorance that only a woman new to Crenmoor Estate could possess. The steam reached me first. It curled out like white fingers and wrapped itself around my face, warm and suffocating. The scent of cedarwood and something sharper, something I could not name, filled my nose instantly. 3 candles burned on a tall iron stand near the far wall. Their flames bent sideways from the rush of air my entrance had created. And then I saw him. I wish I could say I looked away immediately. I wish I could tell you that I was the kind of woman with enough sense and enough dignity to shut that door the very second my eyes registered what they were seeing. But the truth is, I stood there. I stood there for 3 full heartbeats before a single muscle in my body agreed to obey me. Dorian Ashvale, the Duke of Crenmoor, did not move. He did not scramble. He did not shout. He stood with the stillness of a man who had never once been startled by anything in his entire life. His back was partly turned, one hand resting flat against the stone wall beside the washing basin. He was tall in a way that the room itself seemed too small to contain him. His shoulders were broad and rigid, carved from years of doing things men of his rank rarely did themselves. There were old marks on his skin, faint lines that told stories his face never would. He turned slowly, not quickly, not in anger. Slowly, deliberately, like a man choosing exactly how much power to give a moment before it escaped him. His eyes were gray, not the soft gray of morning fog or the gentle gray of worn linen. They were the hard, cutting gray of a sky about to split open with lightning. And they found me, standing in his doorway like a fool with my hand still on the door handle, and they simply held me there. I could not breathe. "You," he said. And even that single word carried the weight of a full sentence, "are not my valet." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. My throat had sealed itself shut in protest of this entire situation. His gaze did not drop. It did not wander. It stayed fixed on my face with a precision that made me feel like a document being read and assessed for errors. I finally managed, and my voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "I was looking for the linen chamber." He said nothing for a moment. The candles kept flickering. Steam kept rising from the basin behind him. The silence in that room was not an empty silence. It was the kind that pressed against your ears and made you hear your own heartbeat far too loudly. "The linen chamber," he repeated slowly, as though he was tasting each word before deciding what to do with it, "is in the western corridor." "I was told eastern," I said, and I do not know where that small correction came from, because every sensible part of me was screaming that this was absolutely not the moment to argue directions with the Duke of Crenmoor. Something shifted in his expression. It was not softness. It was not warmth. It was something closer to the way a man looks when he encounters a thing that does not quite fit into any category he is prepared for. "Then Petty has sent you wrong again," he said. "You know Petty?" I asked, before my mouth and my brain could agree on whether that question was appropriate. "She has worked in this house for 11 years, he said, "and she has given wrong directions for 11 years. I have not replaced her because she is otherwise exceptional." I stared at him. He stared at me. The steam continued rising. Neither of us moved. "You are the new companion," he said. It was not a question. His voice had shifted into something that felt more like an assessment being filed away than a greeting being offered. "I am," I said. "Corvin Ashby, my lord. Miss Corvin Ashby, companion to your cousin, Lady Drusilla." He looked at me for one long, unreadable moment. Then he reached to his left without looking away from my face and lifted his shirt from where it hung across a wooden rail. He pulled it over his head with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided the moment of surprise was over and life would now continue as scheduled. "Miss Ashby," he said, straightening his collar, "in this house, you knock." "Yes, my lord," I whispered. "You knock," he continued, "on every door. Particularly in the eastern corridor. Particularly after 7 in the evening." "I understand, my lord." "I wonder if you do," he said. And there was something in those 4 words, something layered beneath them that I could not quite reach, something that made the back of my neck feel warm in a way the steam could not account for. I stepped back. I pulled the door shut. I stood in the corridor alone with my hand pressed flat against the wood and my eyes closed, and my heart making an absolute spectacle of itself inside my chest. I had been at Crenmoor Estate for exactly 6 hours, and I had already walked in on the Duke. I pressed my back against the cold wall and forced 3 slow breaths through my nose. Down the corridor I could hear the faint clatter of the kitchens far below and the distant voice of Mrs. Pendleton, the housekeeper, directing someone about the dinner linens. The dinner linens that were in the western corridor. I pushed off the wall and walked quickly toward the stairs, my skirts gathered in one fist, my cheeks burning in a way I was deeply grateful no one could see. I did not look back. I would not think about gray eyes. I would not think about the way that room had smelled. I would not think about the old marks on his skin or the unhurried way he had reached for his shirt, as though my presence had inconvenienced him no more than a passing draft. I would think about my position, my purpose. Lady Drusilla Ashvale needed a companion, and I needed employment, and Crenmoor Estate was my only viable option after what had happened in Bath. I would do my job. I would keep my eyes forward. I would knock on every door in this entire enormous house before I opened a single one. I found the western corridor. I found the linen chamber. I retrieved the extra blanket Lady Drusilla had requested before supper. I carried it back to her room and folded it neatly across the foot of her chaise without spilling a word of what had happened. Lady Drusilla, who was 19 and sharp as a paring knife beneath her pretty manners, looked at my face and then looked at it again. "You look as though you have seen a ghost, Miss Ashby," she said. "The estate is very large," I said simply. I took a wrong turn. She accepted this. She returned to her embroidery. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the last of the evening light disappear behind the tree line at the edge of the Crenmoor grounds, and I told myself very firmly that tomorrow would be unremarkable. I was wrong, of course, but I did not know that yet. Morning at Crenmoor Estate arrived without mercy. The bells rang at 6. The housemaids moved through the corridors like a small, determined army. I dressed quickly in my own room, which was modest but clean, tucked between Lady Drusilla's chambers and the small sitting room reserved for household staff of my particular rank. My particular rank, which was neither servant nor guest, but something uncomfortably in between. I had learned early in my career as a companion that this was the loneliest position in any great house. Too refined to eat with the kitchen staff, not refined enough to dine with the family. You existed in a permanent place, useful to everyone and belonging to no one. I pinned my hair, checked that every button on my dress was properly fastened, and went to attend Lady Drusilla. She was already awake and already demanding, which I was beginning to understand was simply her natural state of being. Miss Ashby, I need the letter I wrote to Miss Portia Fenwick sent before noon, and I need my green shawl located because Agnes has misplaced it again. And I would very much like to know whether my cousin has decided if we are riding today or not, because I refuse to sit indoors again. I took a quiet breath and addressed each item in order. I sent word to the footman about the letter. I found the shawl behind the dressing screen where it had slid off the hook. And I volunteered, perhaps unwisely, to go down to the main hall and inquire about the riding arrangement from whoever might know the Duke's schedule for the day. I told myself it was a practical errand. It was a lie I told myself rather convincingly. The main hall of Crenmoor Estate was a cavernous room with a ceiling that seemed to belong to a cathedral, and floors that had absorbed 2 centuries of footsteps into their grain. Portraits lined the upper walls, all Ashvale ancestors, all watching the room below with the same gray eyes that had held me still the previous night. I was staring up at one of them, a stern man in a powdered wig with an expression suggesting he had personally invented disappointment, when a voice came from directly behind me. He won a battle at Harwick in 1743. He is not as frightening as he looks. I turned so quickly I nearly caught my elbow on the hall table. The Duke of Crenmoor was standing 4 feet away from me. He was dressed for the morning, coat on, cravat straight, every inch of him assembled with the kind of precision that made last night feel like something I had imagined entirely, except for the eyes. The eyes were exactly the same. "My lord," I said, and I was proud that my voice came out level. "I did not hear you approach." "You are occupied," he said, glancing up briefly at the portrait, "studying my ancestors." "I was looking for Mr. Hawthorne," I said, naming the head footman. "Lady Drusilla wishes to know about the riding arrangements for today." "There will be no riding today," he said. "I have business with my steward Bartram until early afternoon. Tell Drusilla she may take the east garden if she wishes for fresh air." "I will tell her, my lord." I moved to step past him. He did not move out of my path. Not aggressively, not intentionally, as far as I could tell, but he simply remained standing where he was, and the space between us was suddenly much less than propriety comfortably allowed. "Miss Ashby," he said. I stopped. "Last evening," he began, and every muscle in my body contracted at once. "You said you were directed to the eastern corridor." "Yes, my lord." "Who told you to go east specifically?" I looked up at him. There was something purposeful in the question, something underneath it that I could not yet see clearly. "Petty," I said carefully. "She was very certain about it." He was quiet for a moment. His jaw shifted slightly. Then he said, "Petty knows that corridor is mine. She has known for 11 years. The words settled over me slowly, the way cold water settles, reaching every part before you fully understand how thoroughly you have been soaked. "Are you saying," I said slowly, "that she sent me there deliberately?" He did not answer directly. He said, "Petty is fond of testing new companions. She has her own methods of deciding whether someone is suitable for this house." I stared at him. "She sent me into your private chambers," I said, and I could hear the careful restraint in my own voice, "as a test of my suitability." "She sent you," he said, with something that was almost amusement living at the very edge of his voice, "into my private chambers to see what you would do. Whether you would scream, whether you would faint, whether you would run immediately to Mrs. Pendleton with a dramatic account of the incident." "I did none of those things," I said. "No," he agreed, looking at me with that same assessing stillness. "You did not." Another silence. This one was different from the one in the dressing room. That silence had been shock and steam and confusion. This one was something else entirely. This one had weight and edges. "And what?" I asked, because apparently I had not yet learned to stop asking questions that were not strictly my business. "Was the correct response? The one that would have passed her test?" He tilted his head slightly. Just slightly. "I have no idea," he said. "I have never watched anyone pass it." He stepped aside then. He walked toward the corridor that led to the estate offices without another word or a backward glance. I stood in the hall alone beneath 11 generations of gray eyes and tried to decide what exactly had just happened. By the time I reached Lady Drusilla's rooms with news of the cancelled riding, my face was composed and my thoughts were filed away behind the very reliable door I had built over years of surviving in other people's houses. But something had wedged itself into the frame of that door. Something I could not quite shut out. It was the way he had said, "I have never watched anyone pass it. Not I do not know what the correct response is. Not she has never told me, but I have never watched anyone pass it." Which meant he had watched. Which meant that on some previous occasion, in some version of Petty's test, he had been present to observe the outcome. Which meant last night had not been entirely accidental. I sat down beside Lady Drusilla, picked up the book she had set aside, and began to read aloud in a calm and steady voice. Inside, something was turning over and over and would not be still. At the luncheon, I met the others properly for the first time. The household at Crenmoor was larger than I had initially understood. There was Lord Bastian Cryle, the Duke's younger brother, who arrived late with mud on his boots, and a grin that suggested he considered rules a light suggestion rather than a firm requirement. There was Countess Orinthia Veltmore, an elderly relation of terrifying elegance who had apparently lived at Crenmoor for 3 years following the death of her husband and showed no intention of leaving. There was Mr. Calder Wynne, the Duke's closest friend and frequent houseguest, who had sharp eyes and a talent for saying things that sounded casual, but never quite were. And there was Lady Drusilla, my charge, who sat beside me and whispered commentary about everyone at the table with the swift, merciless precision of a natural observer. The Duke sat at the head of the table and said very little. He directed the conversation when it needed redirecting. He answered questions about the economy. He ate with the contained deliberateness of a man who treated every action as something worth doing correctly. He did not look at me. Not once. Not even when Calder Wynne leaned slightly across the table and asked me directly how I was finding Crenmoor Estate after my first full day. "Larger than I expected," I said honestly, "and full of surprises." Bastian Cryle laughed at that, bright and uncomplicated. Countess Orinthia looked at me over the rim of her water glass with eyes that had seen entirely too much to be deceived by a neutral answer. The Duke cut a precise piece of meat and said nothing, and Petty, who came in at that moment to refill the breadbasket, caught my eye across the table with an expression that was entirely too innocent to be innocent at all. I looked at her. She looked at me. Something passed between us that was not quite an apology and not quite a declaration of war, but sat somewhere complicated in between. I reached for my water glass and reminded myself that I was here to do a job. But Crenmoor Estate, I was quickly learning, had no interest in letting anyone simply do their job. Not when its duke stood in steaming rooms and asked whether you were lost or bold. Not when its housemaid sent you down wrong corridors on purpose. Not when its gray eyes refused to look at you at dinner in a way that somehow felt louder than if they had. I would keep my door shut, I decided. I would keep every door in this house firmly, properly shut, starting with the ones in the eastern corridor. The carriage arrived before I had time to prepare myself for what it carried. I was in the East Garden with Lady Drusilla, who was reading and occasionally complaining about the wind disturbing her pages, when we heard wheels on the gravel drive. Heavy, expensive, the kind of carriage that announces itself before the door even opens. Lady Drusilla sat upright so fast her book tumbled from her lap. "No," she said, and the brightness drained out of her voice like water out of a cracked vessel. "No, he would not dare." I picked up her book. "Who is it?" She did not answer. She watched the footman move forward. She watched the carriage door open, and something in her face did something I had not seen it do before. It went afraid. The man who stepped out was tall, beautifully dressed, and smiling before he had fully straightened from the carriage step. That smile arrived too fast, too wide, the kind of smile that has been practiced so long it no longer knows it is a performance. He was perhaps 40, with the particular handsomeness of a man who has spent considerable money maintaining it. His name, I would learn within the hour, was Lord Prescott Dunmore, Earl of Westing. And I want to tell you something about that first moment of seeing him, because it matters. There was nothing obviously wrong with him. That was the most frightening thing. He looked like a gentleman. He moved like a gentleman. If you had shown me his portrait without context, I would have thought nothing of it. But I had spent years moving through houses that were not mine, reading rooms the way you read weather, and something in the air of Crenmoor shifted the moment his boot touched the gravel. Like a key turning in a lock you did not know was there. "He is here for the estate," Lady Drusilla said softly. I turned to look at her fully. "What do you mean?" "Dorian has no heir," she said, her voice stripped to its bones. "Dunmore is next in the male line if the title falls. He has been working for 2 years to make sure it does fall." The coldness that moved through me then had nothing to do with the wind. "Working how?" I asked. She picked up her book and held it without opening it, the way people hold things when they need something in their hands to stay steady. 3 years ago," she said, "Dorian was engaged. Her name was Miss Alethea Pembroke. She was quiet and good and far too gentle for the weight this title carries. But he had chosen her." She paused. 2 months before the wedding, a set of letters reached her family. Fabricated letters? We are nearly certain, suggesting Dorian had conducted himself dishonorably with another woman during the engagement. I sat very still. I thought about the Duke walking his corridors alone in the early morning. I thought about the controlled way he moved through his own house, like a man who had learned not to expect warmth in it. And I thought about what it costs a person to have something taken from them by a lie they cannot disprove. "The engagement broke," Lady Drusilla continued. "Alethea married someone else within the year. And Dunmore has visited Crenmoor twice yearly since, smiling that smile, waiting for the title to become available." I looked back at the man on the drive. He had spotted us in the garden. He raised his hand in a gesture of easy, charming greeting. I did not wave back. "Can I ask you something honestly? If you had been standing in that garden and you had just heard what I heard, what would you have done? Because I will tell you what I felt. I felt the particular anger that comes not from something happening to you, but from watching something unfair happen to someone who never asked you to care about them, and realizing too late that you already do." Lady Drusilla did not wave back either. Dunmore stayed for dinner. He sat at the table like a man rehearsing ownership. He complimented Mrs. Pendleton's cooking with the practiced warmth of someone who knows the value of winning servants before winning masters. He told 2 stories that were very funny if you did not examine too carefully who the quiet target of each one was. He called Bastian an old friend in a tone that made Bastian's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. And then he looked at me. Not the way the Duke looked at me. The Duke's gaze was contained and precise, and asked nothing of you it did not intend to earn. Dunmore looked at me the way a man looks at something he is already calculating a purpose for. I felt it land, and I filed it away, and I kept my face perfectly pleasant. "Miss Ashby," he said, tilting his glass slightly in my direction, "how long have you been at Crenmoor?" "4 days, my lord," I said. "And how do you find it?" "Very well ordered," I said, "and excellently managed." He smiled. "Yes, Dorian does run a tight estate. A shame he runs it alone." The table went quiet by one precise degree. The Duke at the head of the table cut his meat with the same calm he always carried. He did not look up. He did not respond. He simply continued as though Dunmore had remarked on the weather. But I saw his hand. Just for a moment. The way his fingers tightened once around his knife and then, with clear, deliberate effort, released. One small movement. Completely controlled. Telling me everything. After dinner, the women moved to the drawing room, and Countess Orinthia sat beside me with the decisive force of a woman who has already decided what she is going to say and has dismissed any possibility of being stopped. "You are observant," she said, without introduction. "I try to be," I said. "I watched you at dinner," she said. "You noticed things others chose not to." She paused. "Dunmore is dangerous. He has been pulling threads from this estate for 3 years. Quietly. And no one takes him seriously enough except me, and people mistake age for irrelevance." "What kind of threads?" I asked. She looked at me with eyes that had seen entirely too much to be deceived by a careful face. "He has someone inside this house," she said. Lady Drusilla played something soft at the piano. Agnes stood near the door. The fire crackled between us. "Someone feeding him information," the Countess continued, "about the Duke's schedule, his correspondence, his private affairs. Someone who has been doing it long enough that Dunmore arrives here already knowing things he should not." I moved quietly through every face I had learned in 4 days. "Why are you telling me?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "Because you walked through the wrong door 4 nights ago, and you did not scream, or run, or perform. And the person most useful in a house like this is always the one who already knows how to keep their head when everything else has gone sideways." She stood and walked away to accept her tea. I sat with the fire on my face, and something cold running underneath my skin. Someone inside this house. I thought about Petty and her wrong directions. I thought about Calder Wynne and his careful smile. I thought about Agnes standing near every door. And then, though I tried not to, I thought about gray eyes, and a voice asking whether I was lost or bold, and the fact that I still had not given that question a true answer. Not even to myself. I found the letter by accident, which was, I was beginning to understand, simply how Crenmoor Estate operated. It handed you things you were not looking for, and then waited to see what you would do with them. It was early morning, barely light, and I had gone to the library for a volume Lady Drusilla had requested. The library was long and dark, and smelled of leather and thyme, and I had come to love it in the quiet, selfish way you love rooms that ask nothing of you. I was reaching for the 3rd shelf when I heard the far door open. I stepped back into the narrow gap between 2 tall shelves. Not hiding, simply not announcing myself, which was a habit built from years of moving carefully through houses where being invisible was a form of safety. It was Mr. Silt, Dunmore's secretary. A thin, folded sort of man who had arrived with his employer, and who I had noticed spoke very little, and watched a very great deal. He crossed the library quickly. He went to the writing desk near the window. He opened the second drawer, which should have been locked. He took something out, looked at it, folded it, placed it inside his coat, and left the way he had come. I stood between the shelves and did not breathe until his footsteps were completely gone. Then I went to the desk. The second drawer sat slightly open. Inside, nothing remained except a faint rectangular impression in the dust and a single broken wax seal that had fallen into the corner. I picked it up and turned it over. The Crenmoor crest. Dark red wax, broken cleanly in two. Someone had opened the Duke's private correspondence, left it in this drawer, and Dunmore's man had just walked out with it. I want you to understand what I felt in that moment, because it was not simple. It was not just an alarm. It was the specific horrible feeling of watching a wrong thing happen and knowing that staying quiet would make you part of it. I had stayed quiet before, in other houses, about smaller things, and I had carried those silences like stones ever since. Not this time. I closed the drawer. I closed my hand around the broken seal, and I went to find the Duke. I found him in the east corridor where he walked each morning before the house woke. He was at the turn near the window overlooking the kitchen gardens, and when he saw me approaching with purpose at that hour, his expression shifted into something alert. "Miss Ashby?" he said. I opened my hand and showed him the seal. He looked at it. Something moved across his face, quick and contained, the way a flame moves in a sealed room. There and gone before you could fully name it. "Where?" he said. "The library writing desk," I said. "Second drawer. Silt took something from it less than 10 minutes ago." "Silt is not my secretary," he said quietly. "He is Dunmore's." "I know," I said. "That is why I am telling you." He took the seal from my palm without touching my hand. I noticed. I told myself it meant nothing, and moved directly past it. "You were in the library," he said, "retrieving a book for Lady Drusilla. And you saw him." "I was between the shelves. He did not see me." The Duke looked at the seal for a long moment. Then he looked at me and I felt it again. That shift from assessment into something closer to real attention. The kind that is given rather than performed. The kind that lands differently because you can feel the difference. "Miss Ashby," he said, "how much has my cousin told you about Dunmore?" "Enough," I said carefully. "And the Countess?" He almost smiled. "Not fully. Just that comma of an expression, brief and acknowledging." "She talked to you," he said. "I am not surprised. She talked to the last 3 companions before you." "She said someone inside the house is feeding him information," I said. He was quiet. He looked out at the gray morning pressing against the kitchen garden, and for the first time since I had arrived at Crenmoor, I saw something underneath his composure that composure could not fully cover. He looked tired. Not physically. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from being careful for too long without anyone standing alongside you in it. "I have 3 candidates," he said, "and no proof against any of them. Dunmore is careful. Careful enough to destroy an engagement without leaving a traceable thread." "The letters to Miss Pembroke's family," I said quietly. He turned back to me. His expression closed quickly, like a shutter pulled across a window. "Drusilla," he said flatly. "She told me because she trusts me," I said, "and because she is frightened for you." Something crossed his face, brief and unguarded and gone before I could see it fully. "I do not need frightening over," he said. "She knows that," I said. "She is frightened anyway. That is what people do when they care about someone. They are frightened anyway, whether it is convenient or not." He looked at me in a way that made the corridor feel smaller. Not uncomfortably, just smaller. like the space between us was taking up more room than the space around us. "You have been here 5 days," he said. "Yes, my lord." "In 5 days you have walked into my private chambers, interrogated me about Petty's methods, identified Dunmore's intentions at dinner before half the table, and brought me evidence of correspondence theft before breakfast." I said nothing. "What exactly are you, Miss Ashby?" he said slowly. And here is the thing about that question. It did not feel like an accusation. It did not feel like suspicion. It felt like someone looking at you, truly looking and asking because they genuinely wanted to know. I had not been asked that question sincerely in a very long time, and I felt the weight of it somewhere it had no business reaching. "A woman doing her job," I said, "and trying to do it well." He looked at me for one more long moment. Then he said, "Stay close to Drusilla today. Do not go anywhere alone, and do not let Dunmore speak to you privately." "Has he already planned to?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "He will," the Duke said. "You have something he wants." "What do I have?" He tucked the seal into his coat pocket. "Access," he said, "to this house, its rooms, its people, its conversations. You are a companion. You are present in every room and invisible to half the people in them." That is exactly the kind of position Dunmore has always known how to use. The chill that moved through me then was not from the cold morning air. "He will be charming," the Duke continued. "He will offer something that looks like kindness, and he will ask for something small in return, something that sounds completely harmless." "And never is," I said. "And never is," he agreed. He stepped back, straightened. The brief, unguarded quality sealed itself away behind his composure again, gently and completely, like a book closed on a page you wanted to keep reading. "Thank you, Miss Ashby," he said, "for the seal." He walked back toward the main house. I stood at the window and watched the morning gather itself over the kitchen garden, and I thought about tired eyes and broken seals, and a man carrying 3 years of careful patience with nowhere to set it down. I thought about leaving. I considered it fully and honestly. I had left before. I knew how. But then I thought about Lady Drusilla and her fallen book. I thought about Countess Orinthia and her ancient, undeceived eyes. I thought about Petty and her 11 years of wrong directions that were apparently also a form of love. And I thought about a voice in a steaming room asking whether I was lost or bold. I still had not answered that question properly, but I was beginning to understand what the true answer was. I pushed off the window ledge and went to attend Lady Drusilla. I was not going anywhere. Dunmore found me on the second day of his visit. I had known he would. The Duke had warned me. The Countess had warned me in her particular oblique way. Even Lady Drusilla had grabbed my arm that morning and said, with more urgency than her usual brightness allowed, "Watch yourself with him, Corvin. He smiles the way a trap smiles." I had thought I was prepared. I was not fully prepared. He caught me in the portrait hall in the late afternoon, which was the one place in Crenmoor estate where I had allowed myself to linger without purpose. I had developed a quiet habit of walking through it when Lady Drusilla rested, studying the faces of the Ashvale line and learning the history of this house through its painted walls. And I want to be honest with you about why I kept going back to that hall. It was not purely historical curiosity. It was because every face on those walls carried the same gray eyes, and standing among them felt, uncomfortably and inexplicably, like standing near something familiar. Dunmore appeared at the far end of the hall with the unhurried ease of a man who had arranged the encounter and wanted it to feel accidental. "Miss Ashby," he said, his voice warm and rounded, trained to make every person it addressed feel uniquely seen. "I had hoped to find a moment with you." "My lord," I said, and kept my voice neutral and my feet still. He came to stand beside me in front of the large portrait of the fourth Duke of Crenmoor, a heavy-faced man with the same grey eyes every Ashvale carried through generations. I did not look at Dunmore. I kept my eyes on the portrait. "Remarkable family line," he said pleasantly, though not without its difficulties. I said nothing. I had learned from the Duke that silence was a form of armor. "You are new here," he continued, "and perhaps do not know the full history of this estate. The Ashvale title has been under considerable strain. Debts, you understand. Very old debts that have been quietly accumulating. A lie, a clean, confident lie delivered with the smoothness of long practice. I knew it was a lie because Lady Drusilla had shown me the estate accounts 3 days prior, quite proudly, explaining that her cousin had rebuilt Crenmoor's finances from near ruin when he inherited at 22 and had run it cleanly profitable for 8 years since. But I let him continue. I wanted to hear exactly how far he would take it. "Dorian is a proud man," Dunmore said, with the practiced sorrow of someone performing concern. "Too proud to ask for help. Too proud to admit when things exceed him. It is the great Ashvale failing, I am afraid." He turned to look at me then. Full, direct, warm. The complete performance. "I wonder," he said, "whether you have noticed anything in your time here. In your position as companion, you move through many rooms. You hear many conversations. Nothing specific, of course. Simply the general feeling of the house. Whether the Duke seems troubled. Whether things are well managed." There it was. Exactly as described. Small. Reasonable. Wrapped so carefully in false concern that a younger version of me, a more frightened version, might have believed she was simply being asked for an opinion. I looked at Lord Dunmore fully for the first time in that conversation. I looked at him the way the Countess had taught me to look at things, not at the surface, but at the shape beneath it. And I understood completely what he was. Not a villain in any dramatic sense. Something more dangerous than that. A patient, intelligent man who had chosen ambition over decency so long ago that he no longer remembered it had been a choice. A man who had looked at another person's life and decided it was a resource. I thought about Alethea Pembroke, who had been quiet and good and had deserved none of what reached her. I thought about fabricated letters and a wedding that never happened, and a duke who walked his corridors alone every morning because someone had taken something from him that patience and pride would not let him name aloud. And I felt something harden in me that I did not try to soften. "My lord," I said quietly, "I am Lady Drusilla's companion. The Duke's affairs are not mine to observe, and if I did observe them, they would not be mine to share." His smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. Something recalculated. "Of course," he said smoothly, "I meant no impropriety. Only concern for a house I care deeply about." "Your concern is noted," I said. "If you will excuse me, my lady will be waking from her rest." I walked away from him at a measured pace. I did not hurry. I did not look back. But the moment I turned the corner into the next corridor, I pressed myself against the wall and let out a breath that had been sitting in my chest like a stone since the moment he had appeared at the far end of that hall. I want you to ask yourself something. If you had been standing in that portrait hall, with no title and no protection and a position that depended entirely on the goodwill of a household you had been in for less than a week, would you have said what I said? Or would the risk have felt too great? Because I will tell you honestly, it felt very great. It felt enormous. And I said it anyway. That evening I went to the Duke. I found him in the estate office with Bartram, and I waited outside until the steward emerged and nodded at me with the quiet discretion of a man who had learned not to ask questions above his station. I knocked twice, cleanly. "Come," said the Duke. He was at his desk with his coat removed and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, surrounded by papers. working as he always seemed to be working, with the focused intensity of a man who treated every responsibility as a personal debt to be repaid. He looked up, and something in his face when he saw me, something small and quick, shifted before he controlled it. "He approached you," he said immediately. "In the portrait hall," I confirmed. "He suggested the estate was in financial difficulty and asked me to share general observations about your state of mind and the management of the house." The Duke set down his pen. "What did you tell him?" "That I was Lady Drusilla's companion, and your affairs were not mine to share." He was quiet. Then, "Did he believe you would stay silent?" "No," I said honestly. "I think he has already decided I am either an obstacle or a resource. He will try again with a different approach." The Duke looked at me steadily. "You understand him quickly." "I have met men like him before," I said. "In smaller houses with smaller stakes. The method is always the same. The false concern. The small request dressed as nothing. And the women he uses," the Duke said, and his voice had gone quieter and harder. "They always believe they are helping, that they are doing something kind." I thought of Miss Alethea Pembroke, of those letters, of what it means to have your life altered by a lie someone else constructed while you were simply trying to love someone honestly. "The letters to her family," I said carefully. "Dunmore used someone inside this house to make them convincing, someone who knew enough about your private life to make fabricated details believable." The Duke's expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness did. "You have been thinking about this," he said. "I have been thinking about little else," I admitted, and I did not look away when I said it, which cost me something but felt necessary. He stood. He moved to the window the way he always moved, with that deliberate quality, and looked out at the dark grounds. "Her name was Alethea," he said, and his voice was flat and careful the way voices become when they are carrying something heavy and have spent years learning not to let the weight show. "She deserved better than what happened to her. Better than the life this title carries. Better than me, truthfully." "You cared for her," I said softly. "I intended to protect her," he said, which was not the same thing, and we both knew it. "I failed before we had even begun." "Dunmore failed her," I said. "Not you." He turned from the window. His gray eyes found mine across the room with the same directness they had found mine across a steaming dressing room 9 days ago. And something passed between us in that moment that neither of us reached for and neither of us stepped away from. "Miss Ashby," he said, and his voice had moved into that underneath register, the one that was not the Duke's voice, but the man's voice, the one I had heard only twice before, and both times it had done something to the air in the room. "Why did you come to this house?" "Employment," I said. "Where before?" I looked at him. He waited with the patience of a man who had decided he wanted the true answer and had no interest in a comfortable substitute. "Bath," I said. "I was a companion to Lady Harcourt. She dismissed me after 6 months because her son developed an attachment. I did not encourage, and she chose not to believe me." The room was very quiet. "So you came here," he said. "There were not many options," I said honestly. Crenmoor was advertising, and it was far enough from Bath that the story had not yet traveled. "And when it does travel here?" he asked, "as these things always do." I lifted my chin. "Then I will manage it the same way I manage everything. Directly and without apology, because I did nothing wrong." He looked at me for a long, still moment. "No," he said quietly, "I do not imagine you did." The candles burned steadily between us. Neither of us spoke. And the silence this time was not the silence of a steaming room and a wrong door. It was something else. Something that had been building in corridors and libraries and early morning windows for 9 days and had arrived here quietly without announcing itself. Then the door opened without a knock, and Bastian came in with his hair disordered and his easy brightness completely gone from his face. "Dorian," he said, and the first name without title told me everything before the next word came. "Silt has been found in your private correspondence room. He has your personal seal and 3 letters from the locked cabinet." The Duke moved before Bastian finished the sentence. I followed without being asked. I ran after the Duke of Crenmoor through his own house, past startled footmen and wide-eyed Agnes and Petty, who pressed herself flat against the wall and watched us pass with sharp, frightened eyes, until we reached the small locked room off the main study. Mr. Silt stood in the center of it with 3 letters in his hand and the expression of a man whose plan had collapsed faster than he built it. Dunmore stood behind him. He had stopped smiling. And for the first time since that carriage had rolled through the Crenmoor gate, Lord Prescott Dunmore looked exactly like what he was. "Dorian," he said, and the smoothness in his voice had gone threadbare at every edge. "This is a misunderstanding." "It is not a misunderstanding," the Duke said, and his voice was the coldest and most final thing I had ever heard a human being produce. "It is the end." The letters were read aloud in the Duke's study, every word of them. Dunmore sat across from the Duke with Bastian at the door and Calder Wynne by the fireplace with his arms crossed and his sharp mind working visibly behind his composed face. Countess Orinthia had arrived without being summoned, because she always arrived exactly where she was needed without explanation or apology. She sat in the high-backed chair near the window like a judge who had already reached her verdict and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. I stood near the door. It was my proper place. I stayed because no one told me to leave, and because the Duke had not looked at me in a way that suggested I should. The first letter was a financial record. A real one, apparently, because the Duke's expression confirmed it before he controlled his reaction. A record of a debt paid 3 years ago to a creditor in Edinburgh, whose name Dunmore had somehow obtained and held in reserve, like a knife, kept clean for a specific moment. "You plan to use this," the Duke said, "to suggest insolvency." Dunmore said nothing. The second letter was worse. A private medical correspondence between the Duke and a physician about an injury sustained 2 years prior that had been slow to heal. The kind of letter that, placed in wrong hands with wrong framing, could be shaped into a suggestion of weakness or incapacity. The kind of letter that could make trustees nervous and solicitors ask questions and a title feel suddenly unstable in the hands holding it. I watched the Duke read it. I watched him keep his face completely still, and I thought about what it costs a person to sit in a room full of people and read their own private pain being handled as ammunition. Then the third letter was unfolded, and my breath stopped. It was addressed to a Miss Corvin Ashby of Bath, a letter of reference, purportedly from Lady Harcourt. But not the letter Lady Harcourt had actually provided me. A fabricated version, carefully worded, that described the incident with her son in terms designed to suggest that it had been my fault. My pursuit. My calculated design on a vulnerable young man in his own mother's house. Every word of it was a lie. Every single word had been constructed to destroy me. I want you to understand what it feels like to stand in a room and hear your own character being read aloud in a voice that is not yours, shaped into a story you did not live. It is not simply anger. It is something older and colder than anger. It is the feeling of having the floor shift beneath you and realizing that someone has been quietly loosening the boards for weeks. Dunmore had seen me refuse him in the portrait hall. He had assessed me as an obstacle, and he had moved, immediately and without hesitation, to have me removed from Crenmoor before I became a larger problem. Whether he had intended to use it against me directly, or against the Duke by association, or simply to have me dismissed and discredited before I could say another word, I could not be entirely certain. But the intent was clear enough. The Duke read the third letter in complete silence, Then he looked up and found me across the room. I do not know what my face was doing. I had spent years learning to keep it still. But this was the first time something fabricated about me had been read aloud in a room full of people whose opinions of me were not yet fully formed, and I was not entirely certain my composure was as intact as I needed it to be. Whatever the Duke saw in my face, something in his own changed. Not subtly. Not in the controlled, contained way he usually permitted himself to change. Something in him shifted with a decisiveness that was visible to everyone in the room, and every person there felt it, because Bastian straightened, and Calder Wynne uncrossed his arms, and Countess Orinthia set her hands very deliberately in her lap. He set the letter down. He looked at Dunmore with an expression that was not anger. Anger was too simple and too loud for what lived in his face at that moment. It was something older and more complete than anger. It was the expression of a man who has been patient for 3 years through things that deserved fury, and who has now decided, with absolute calm, that patience has concluded. "Get out of my house," he said. Dunmore attempted to reassemble himself. He tried to find the smooth, confident surface he had carried through every room of Crenmoor estate for 2 days. One last attempt to be the man who controlled every outcome. "Dorian, you cannot simply— You will take your secretary," the Duke said, and each word was placed with the precision of something being permanently recorded. "And your carriage and you will leave Crenmoor estate within the hour. You will not return. You will not write. You will not send intermediaries. If I find a single further action taken against this estate or anyone within it, every document in this room goes to every relevant authority in England, and I will not stop until your name means precisely what it should." The silence that followed had weight and edges and filled every corner of the room. Dunmore left. Silt followed behind him like a shadow that had lost its source. The door closed. Bastian released a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in his chest. Calder Wynne stepped back from the fireplace. Countess Orinthia tilted her head by a precise degree, the closest she ever came to visible satisfaction. Then everyone looked at the third letter still lying on the desk. The Duke picked it up. He held it over the candle flame without ceremony or hesitation or any performance of significance. We all watched it catch and darken and curl and reduce to nothing, and he set the ash carefully in the empty fireplace grate. "That letter," he said, "to the room and to me, did not exist." Lady Drusilla, who had appeared at some point during the confrontation and had been standing beside me with her hand pressed over her mouth, made a small sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh, and pressed her forehead briefly to my shoulder. I pressed my lips together, and something in me, some tightly wound thing that had been coiled since Bath and before Bath and through every difficult house and every long corridor, and every position held by the thin thread of someone else's goodwill, loosened by one long, slow degree. The household took 3 days to settle. There were letters to write, and staff to reassure, and the matter of identifying Dunmore's source inside Crenmoor, which turned out to be not Petty and not Agnes and not Calder Wynne, but a young underfootman named Gristle, who had been quietly recruited during a trip to the village 4 months prior, and who had genuinely believed he was passing harmless information to a concerned family relation of the Duke. Gristle wept when it was discovered. He was 19 and frightened, and had understood too late what he had actually been part of. The Duke dismissed him from service, which was necessary, but arranged a private letter to a house in the north, where the young man might begin again, without the full weight of this following him permanently. Lady Drusilla told me about it afterward with a quiet, fierce pride in her voice, as though daring me not to understand why it mattered. I understood completely. I was understanding more about the Duke of Crenmoor with every passing day, and none of what I was understanding was making it easier to maintain the professional distance my position required. On the 4th day after Dunmore's departure, I was in the library. Legitimately this time. No sheltering between shelves, no broken seals, and no wrongdoing to witness. Just me and a book, and the gray November light coming through tall windows, and a mind that kept moving away from the page toward thoughts I had firmly designated as professionally inappropriate and which refused to stay designated. The Duke found me. He came in quietly and sat down in the chair across from mine, which he had not done before, and he looked at me with an expression I had not yet catalogued. Not the assessing expression, not the formal one. Not the underneath one I had heard twice in his voice, and both times felt in my chest. Something new. Something that had clearly been sitting with him for several days, and had finally decided it was done waiting. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me nothing," I said. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," he said simply, "they would not. I have had 4 companions in this house in 3 years. Not one of them brought me a broken seal before breakfast. Not one refused Dunmore in the portrait hall. Not one stood in my study while a fabricated letter about their own character was read aloud and kept more dignity than I managed to keep." "You kept your composure," I said. "I wanted to put Dunmore through the wall," he said, with such flat directness that something warm moved through my chest without permission. "That is not composure. That is restraint. They are entirely different things." I looked at him. He looked at me. Outside the library windows, the Crenmoor grounds lay gray and still and beautiful in the way November makes everything beautiful, stripped to its essential shape, nothing decorative remaining, only what is genuinely there. "Miss Ashby," he said, and his voice moved into that register, the man's voice beneath the Duke's voice. "I find myself in a situation I did not anticipate when I engaged a companion for my cousin." My heart, which had been behaving itself with moderate success for 13 days, stopped behaving itself. "My lord," I said carefully. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand clearly before I ask it that the answer carries no consequence for your position here. If you say no, you remain Lady Drusilla's companion for as long as you wish. I will not make this house uncomfortable for you. I do not use my rank to create pressure." "I know that," I said quietly. He paused. "How do you know that?" "Because you burned the letter," I said. "Without being asked and without making any performance of it. You simply burned it." Something moved across his face then, open and unguarded, the shudder entirely absent, and I saw what lived beneath the composure and the controlled severity, and the 3 years of careful patience and the early morning corridors, walked alone. I saw a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to simply see him clearly. "I would like," he said slowly, choosing each word with the care of a man who does not say important things carelessly, "to call upon you formally. Not as my cousin's companion, as Miss Corvin Ashby, whom I wish to know properly, and who I believe, if she is willing, might be persuaded to know me in return." The library held its breath. The fire made its small sounds. The November light pressed gently at the windows. Somewhere above us, Lady Drusilla was playing the piano, something bright and insistent and entirely too cheerful for the gravity of this moment, and also, somehow, exactly right. "You hardly know me," I said. "I know that you are not lost," he said, and the echo of that first night hung warm and deliberate between us. "I have known that since the beginning." I looked at him, at the gray eyes that had held me still in a steaming room and found me in corridors and read fabricated words about my character and burned them without ceremony. At the man who rebuilt an estate at 22 and walked its corridors alone every morning and had been patient through things that deserved fury and had never once asked anyone to notice. "Then I am bold," I said quietly. He looked at me with something that was a smile and relief, and entirely more than either of those things combined. Yes, he said softly. I rather thought so. What followed was not swift, because nothing real ever is, and I had learned enough about this man to know that he would not rush what mattered to him. There were weeks of formal calls and chaperoned walks through the Crenmoor grounds, with Lady Drusilla as chaperone, a role she performed with enormous enthusiasm and almost no subtlety whatsoever. There were long conversations in the library and quieter ones at dinner, and one afternoon in the portrait hall, where the Duke told me the history of every Ashvale ancestor on the wall, and I told him the history of every house I had ever worked in. And somewhere in the exchange, something settled between us that had the quiet, permanent quality of a foundation being laid stone by careful stone. Countess Orinthia watched all of it with the contained satisfaction of a woman whose assessment had been entirely correct from the beginning. Petty cried in the kitchen when she heard and then denied it entirely, and produced the finest cake Crenmoor had seen in 2 years, which she attributed to an occasion she refused to specify. Bastian was loudly and completely delighted, which was the only way Bastian did anything. Calderwin shook the Duke's hand, and then looked at me with those careful cataloguing eyes and said, I thought it might be you. From the second morning, when he came to breakfast with an expression none of us could account for. Lady Drusilla said nothing for a long moment when her cousin told her formally. Then she stood and looked at me with her sharp, clever eyes full of something bright and fierce and said, with the precision of someone delivering the truest sentence they have ever constructed, Well, it is about time someone in this house opened the right door. We were married in the chapel at Crenmoor on a morning in February, when the frost still lay across the grounds, and the light came through the old chapel windows in pale, serious streams that made the whole room feel like the inside of something sacred. I stood at the front of that chapel, and I thought about wrong directions and broken seals and steaming rooms and gray eyes that had asked me a question I had spent months learning to answer honestly. The Duke of Crenmoor stood beside me with his composure perfectly intact, and his eyes not on the chapel or the frost light, or the assembled faces of everyone who had watched us find our way to this morning. His eyes were on me, and in them was everything he did not say in excess, everything he kept and held with that contained and careful nature that I had come to understand was not coldness at all. It was the way a man loves when he has decided to love completely and has no intention of doing it any other way. I had walked through the wrong door, and I would walk through it again without hesitation every single time for the rest of my life.